This talk will mostly focus on London and on Mary Evelyn, wife of the famous diarist John Evelyn. What was expected of a competent, genteel housewife? What did she need to know in terms of cooking skills, home remedies, and the management of servants? Luxury imports brought domestic comforts to those with money, but what dangers remained in the home? I'll be looking at cosmetics, medicines, hygiene, and I'll conclude by looking at the frustrations that intelligent women experienced within the confines of the traditional role of 17th century housewife. Let's begin with the household budget. In 1676, or thereabouts, Mary Evelyn sat down to do her husband's bidding and produce some advice about household management for his friend, Margaret Godolphin, pious, recently married, and nervous about exceeding her domestic budget of £500 a year. The young couple had moved into lodgings already furnished with beds, hangings, and chairs, so Mary started with essential kitchen equipment. She grouped the various kitchen pots, pans, shovels, pails, and baskets in a way that would not occur to us now by the material they were made from: tin, iron, brass, pewter, wood, and earthenware. She estimated that it would cost £313 one shilling to set up a genteel household for 8 people in London. By way of comparison, the utensils from a modest kitchen in the maritime district of Wapping in 1659, which included a pewter chamber pot, were valued at just £2 16 shillings and 9pence second hand. A kitchen was understood to be the wife's province, even if she dictated little else about the house. It had become a recognisable space, though other rooms might still be put to flexible use. The inventory of a house in St Giles in the Fields in 1661 listed beds in every room except the kitchen and parlour, which was up 3 pair of stairs backward. A parlour offered some privacy. Building regulations after the Great Fire in 1665 meant that, in the City of London at least, kitchens were usually sited in basements. This made sense if the house had piped water, since gravity made it easier to channel water through leaky elm pipes into a basement. But some London kitchens were still on the ground floor, and the wife of an artisan renting 1 or 2 rooms might even have to cook over the hearth in his workshop. Cooking was still done over an open fire, but in Mary Evelyn's time the fuel was likely to be coal, more efficient than wood. Coal prices fell during the second half of the century, so consumption in London almost doubled. The polluted, smoky air over the metropolis was overwhelmingly due to domestic coal fires. But Mary's household instructions show that wood might still be burnt in upper chambers, if furnished with rich textiles, because coal smoke would damage them. Coal fires meant a grate was needed, superseding fire dogs and the cast iron fireback used for burning logs. The grate was inserted between 2 hobs or brick pillars that made small shelves where food could be kept warm. Samuel Peeps, another famous diarist, modernised his hearth and range in 1661. Few houses had ovens, so pies were sent to be cooked at the nearest baker's, but wives could toast, fry, grill, and roast meats using jack-driven spits or a vertical jack to rotate a joint over a dripping pan. The jack was operated by clockwork or a system of weights, or even in larger premises by a small dog, specially bred with a long body and short legs to run in a treadmill. There was also a smoke jack with fan-like blades, turned by the hot gases from the fire below it. Coal grates did lead to some new equipment. The 3-legged skillet was replaced by a flat-bottom saucepan in the mid-1680s. Sauce making then became more popular, and recipe books gestured towards a new French taste in cooking. Only the poorest cooks were restricted to boiling their meal in a cauldron. A skilled housewife had to be able to judge the heat of different parts of a fire and the cooking times of different joints of meat. Pepys's wife, Elizabeth, got this badly wrong on Christmas Day in 1661, which led to an unseasonable row. Cooking had some parallels with contemporary experimental science. When Hannah Woolley, a writer on household management, introduced a new recipe book, she wrote, "I hear some of you say, I wish Mrs. Woolley would put forth some new experiments." Cookery books rarely specified quantities and never gave cooking times because different fires produced different results. Much in a recipe remained intuitive, a matter of trial and error. The mistress of a house needed to be proficient in more than cookery to earn respect. According to the English housewife, she had to be able to order great feasts, preserve wines, extract oils, and make and dye cloth, and run a dairy. She had to understand distillation, perfumes, and malting, as well as brewing, baking, and, quote, all other things belonging to an household. First published in 1615, this domestic manual went through 9 editions and at least 2 other reprints by 1683, testimony to women's growing literacy. While some of the skills it describes might be more suited to country living, London women needed an exact knowledge of the plants to be found in a townhouse garden, not only for culinary purposes, but also to freshen rooms and relieve common ailments. Households often kept a book of recipes and cures, handed down through generations and compiled over time. Theories of disease were a matter for physicians, but women were expected to know plant-based home remedies, which might help to avoid unexpected medical bills that could wreck a household budget. The English housewife has remedies for disorders such as hemorrhoids, sciatica, pimples, pissing in bed, and rather alarmingly, the falling of the fundament. Where animal ingredients are called for, they signal fading traces of belief in magic. London women were still accused of witchcraft in the 1680s. But extravagant ingredients might also signal desperate measures to be tried when all else failed. The Queen's Closet Opened has a horrific cure for consumption that begins, "Take a running cock, pull him alive, then kill him." Published in 1655, the book was highly regarded, and Mary Evelyn had it in her closet. Syrups and herbs might soothe a cough or help to expel wind, but of the thousands of remedies in common use, few were effective. When Charles II contracted his final illness in 1685, the doctors did not even know what it was. Kidney disease? A stroke? They inflicted every medical torture in their armory, and with their bleedings, purges, and emetics, certainly hastened his departure. Domestic skills apart, a good housewife was expected to be religious, modest, and obedient. Men were brought up to think that their strength and allegedly superior reasoning powers justified male domination over women, supporting the biblical injunction that wives should obey their husbands. The duties of a housewife were even documented on the backs of playing cards. John Evelyn took pains to mould his wife, whom he married in 1647 when she was just 13 years old. Couples could marry young. The minimum age was 12 years for women and 14 for men. Children could get engaged from the age of 7, with the right to break off the engagement when they reached the age of consent. But Evelyn and his friend Peeps, who fell in love and married Elizabeth when she was not quite 15, were both unusual. On average, high-ranking men married women in their mid-20s, and they themselves were perhaps a decade older. Even lower down the social scale, women tended to wed later. Female servants married in their early 20s. Because Evelyn's new wife was so young, she continued to live with her parents. In this context, Evelyn presented her with a handwritten manual on her domestic duties. The couple set up home at Sayes Court, Deptford, in 1652. Evelyn expected Mary to bend to his way of doing things, and she conformed. But she had been brought up to value intellectual development. She spoke 3 languages, had read the classics in translation, and learnt mathematics. As a young wife, she retained her verve. In one letter, she wittily marvelled that men could change the appearance of an entire landscape and expect praise for their husbandry, yet mock women as vain creatures if they altered a little thing like their dress or the pattern of a gorget. Evelyn, for his part, grew to rely on his wife, writing in 1652, "You are myself, and I trust you with all." In his early advice on household economy, Evelyn had included a maxim that a prudent husband should by no means discover unto his wife the utmost secrets of his estate. But he trusted in her discretion, even sending her updates on his painful piles, which prevented him taking a regular dose of rhubarb. If she responded with a salve from the Queen's closet opened, it would have been made with a spoonful of white dog's turd mixed with perfumes, honey, and egg yolk. Not all couples lived harmoniously. Pepys's marriage was turbulent, and since there was no need for a church ceremony, marital irregularities were common. The poor might even dispense with a marriage contract altogether, since a public declaration of intent made a lawful marriage. Those who wished for secrecy could always find an obliging parson to marry them in an empty church, tavern room, or private house. When marriages failed, dependent wives might be thrown onto the parish for relief. Court cases in Middlesex include petitions from wives complaining that husbands have deserted them and refuse to maintain their children, or that a husband pretends to be married to someone else, or has lived with another woman for some time past. The legality of marriage in London's densely populated suburbs was hard to police. Most wives found their pursuits were restricted by childbearing. Mary Evelyn gave birth to 8 children, of which only 4 lived to adulthood, and only 1, Susanna, survived her. She also had at least 3 miscarriages. Elite women who put their babies out to wet nurse had more frequent pregnancies. Wet nurses were usually drawn from the middling sort, and the idea was to give babies a better start in life, perhaps in cleaner air outside London, though some fashionable women may simply have wished to avoid the bother of regular feeds. Mary Evelyn was expected to supervise her household and sometimes share the employments of upper servants, but most poor women had to find work to contribute to the household budget, despite pregnancies. Some helped their husbands if they ran shops or taverns. Many had wholly separate employments. Seamen's wives were often silk winders, since the Spitalfields weaving district was an easy walk from London's eastern maritime parishes. Others found women's work in kitchens as washerwomen or in casual trades like street hawking, which could be fitted around the needs of their family. Given the nature of such temporary work, many women experienced poverty. Astonishingly, the city parishes were about 3 times more crowded than even the most densely populated London boroughs today. Houses might be occupied by two or more households, but individual family units tended to be fairly small. Towards the end of the century, a household in Cheapside averaged 6.6 people, and in poorer Aldgate, 4.5 people. Cheapside had more lodgers, servants, and apprentices, which explains the difference in household size. In both groups, there were few children. They either died or were nursed in the country and soon made their way in the world as teenagers. Any vacant space in a house would be rented to lodgers, who might be wealthier than the host family, given the pressure on accommodation in the city. It's rare to find London housekeeping records in this century, but the advice that Evelyn's wife prepared for Margaret Godolphin in the 1670s indicates the lifestyle of the modestly genteel. Mary Evelyn prepared sample menus for a week, catering for a family of 8 people, including servants. Dinners were heavily meat-based, a joint, followed by a course of fowl and fish, then a dessert of fruit, sweets, and cheese. Although Evelyn's own book on salads, to which Mary contributed recipes, recommended eating more plants and herbs. The annual cost of running such a household, omitting extravagances and eating rabbit and cheaper fowls more often than partridge and pheasant, came to £480, 4 shillings. Her instructions about linen reveal that sheets were washed fortnightly, although servants' bed linen was changed only once a month. The papers of Evelyn's own daughters show that conscientious parents taught girls to keep household accounts. Mary warns Margaret not to hire a gossiping outservant to help with the accounts, but to find a trusty housemaid. She says, "She should be the first of servants stirring and last in bed, and have some authority over the rest. It is necessary also she should know to write, and cast up small sums, and bring you her book every Saturday night, which you may cause to be entered into another for yourself, that you may from time to time judge of prices and things which are continually altering. And such a servant, I tell you, is a jewel not easily to be found, but such there be, and such I wish you." Mary's own letters show how such upper servants might be identified, revealing too how women could help other women who made unfortunate marriages in an age when divorce was almost impossible. She wrote to Peeps recommending a new housekeeper. She is not in so prosperous a way as formerly, yet in no want. Has no charge of children, only one daughter, and that provided for and from her. She has a husband, but he is absent by consent for many years, so that she is almost a free woman, ever very neat, an excellent housewife, not ungenteel, slightly and well behaved, yet of years to allow the necessary experience and prudence to direct in a family and preserve respect. Her description shows what employers valued, though Peeps found the woman a bit of a shrew. Poorer households had few servants or none, used wooden rather than pewter plates, and ate a much more restricted diet than that set out by Mary Evelyn. Staple foods were bread, cheese, onions, and beer. Pottage was another basic, made by boiling grains over the fire, adding vegetables and sometimes meat. Those with limited cooking facilities or just push for time bought food from street vendors or victualling houses. In May 1668, Peeps made a good meal of half a breast of mutton off a spit in the Rose Tavern, Covent Garden, before the play started. How did the genteel and middling sort aspire to live? In 1696, the advertisement for a sale of goods in an upmarket house in Buckingham Street off the Strand lists hangings, looking glasses, lined beds, chests of drawers, carpets of several sorts, a japanned cabinet, and pewter and brass items from the kitchen. Hannah Woolley, who was something of a social climber, gives further clues in her books on domestic management. She had worked as a servant in an aristocratic household before marrying a schoolmaster and moving to Hackney, a parish in northeast London. When her husband died, she married an eligible widower in fashionable Westminster. In the queen-like closet, she gives directions for embroidering chair covers, making wall hangings, framing pictures, and decorating wainscot by cutting out prints and gluing them to the wood. Her recipes for using up food scraps suggests that she imagined housewives would economize in some areas in order to emulate the latest home decorations. Peeps, also upwardly mobile, spent a great deal on home improvements once he moved into a house in Seething Lane, west of Tower Hill, a perk of his Navy office job. The growth in England's foreign trade meant that the moderately well-off now enjoyed a greater range of foodstuffs and wine. The main meal was taken at midday. Table manners were improving. It was common to use smaller forks at meals so that people no longer needed to eat with their fingers. Life for the rich became more refined, if not more luxurious. Furniture became lighter. There was a shortage of oak from overuse and wartime shipbuilding, so chairs were often made of walnut and from the 1670s featured cane work, which was cheaper than upholstery. Families might have lighter folding tables since, in a major advance towards privacy and status, many no longer dined with servants and apprentices. The demand for Oriental textiles soared, encouraged by the East India Company, which now imported calicos and chintzes from the port of Bombay, which had been part of Catherine of Braganza's dowry when she married King Charles II. The company also traded Indian goods with the Far East, bringing back tea and porcelain from China, and lacquer furniture from Japan. These exotic imports were much sought after and stimulated English production of pottery, glassware, silk, and textiles. Some things remain the same. In an age when laundry day brought turmoil and housewives battled with coal dust every day, clean linen remained a mark of status. But the use of new luxury items was an index of wealth and a means to compliment guests. When Susanna Evelyn got engaged to William Draper in 1693 and visited her future mother-in-law in Surrey Street, her parents were breathlessly gratified that she, quote, was received magnificently, her apartment damask bed and hangings, her dressing room filled with a Japan-styled cabinet, china tea table, cups, teapot, chamber plate, in the best manner. Fine so-called Indian things made popular wedding presents, and drinking chocolate, increasingly popular since the 1650s, was also considered a refined gift. Evelyn's other daughter, Mary, was very pleased with a present of 12 boxes of chocolate and 2 fine cups trimmed with silver filigree. In London, female literacy in Mary Evelyn's time was close to 50% and rising. Hannah Woolley included sample letters for different situations in her book, The Queen-like Closet, understanding that some female readers would wish to improve their writing skills. Sadly, many women wrote to commiserate about the deaths of children. They also shared remedies for common ailments, and so many cures were circulated that authors of household manuals often collated recipes rather than inventing them. But elite women also used letter writing to advance family interests. Mary Evelyn wrote to one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, sending homemade cake, as the Queen had lately wished for cake, but asking to remain anonymous as it was such a lowly gift. But it surely did her family no harm. She also wrote to Peeps to secure employment for a sea captain, fallen on hard times, who was married to a relation. And in turn, she received letters from friends whose husbands wanted to be presented at court. Letter writing offered women a route into flourishing amateur literary networks and participation in other aspects of intellectual life. Women were not allowed to join the Royal Society, but could at least read Thomas Sprat's History of the Society and hold opinions about the style he advocated for scientific writing. Mary Evelyn engaged in this discussion, writing about Sprat's book to Ralph Byrne, her son's tutor. "I never liked anything more," she wrote, "not only because it is written in the defence of worthy and learned men, or of a cause which promises so many future advantages, but that his notions are conveyed in so just, easy, and polite expressions, in known and yet not vulgar English." Letter writing also gave women opportunities to engage with politics and current affairs. Mary, wife of Captain Thomas Bowery, who lived in Wellclose Square, London, wrote to him when he was at sea. She was careful to send the latest news about English relations with the Barbary States on the North African coast, since Barbary corsairs regularly attacked merchant shipping. Yet housewives were often conflicted. Mary Evelyn was torn between fulfilling her household duties and keeping up to date so that she could discuss intellectual matters with male acquaintances without fear of ridicule. Ralph Byrne praised her letters, her even style and masculine notions, and said it was hard to believe a woman could write so well. Yet when she sent him her opinion of Dryden's latest play, The Conquest of Granada, she added pointedly that if she had not done the play justice, it was as much as could be expected, quote, "from the leisure of one who has the care of a nursery." Her son Jack was a young man, but she had 3 daughters under the age of 6 at home. Later, when Byrne complained that she had not written in a while, she set out the nature of her dilemma. She might live, quote, "under the roof of the learned and in the neighbourhood of science, but," she continued, "women were not born to read authors and censure the learned, to compare lives and judge of virtues, to give rules of morality and sacrifice to the muses. We are willing to acknowledge all time borrowed from family duties is misspent. The care of children's education, observing a husband's commands, assisting the sick, relieving the poor, and being serviceable to our friends." She added with some bitterness that if a woman did rise above her station and do something extraordinary, she was rewarded with wonder, not esteem. Conduct books aimed at genteel women might insist on female submissiveness, but not all women of Mary Evelyn's rank were happy to be compliant in male-run households, or eager to practice their writing skills for polite correspondence. This much is evident from her own daughters. Mary, the eldest, made notes on sermons, sang opera songs in French and Italian, played the harpsichord, and was the delight of her parents, who were devastated when she died of smallpox, aged 19. Elizabeth, their middle daughter, eloped with a local dockyard official, tragically succumbing to smallpox soon afterwards. Their youngest, Susanna, never took to learning. Her letters as a teenager are a mess of blots, and as the sole surviving daughter, she struggled to live up to expectation. Fortunate women did manage to pursue their own interests at home. Well-educated families placed value on women's artistic skills, and Susanna mercifully found that she had a talent for art and Japanning. It accorded well with her father's artistic interests. He had got his own recipe for the Japanese varnish on his European travels, but failed to patent it. Susanna's mother-in-law also proved supportive. She herself found time to paint, as well as carry household and social responsibilities. Susanna would also have liaised with the network of female amateur artists in London, and at least known of Mary Beale, who made a living as a portrait painter. Beale had an egalitarian view of marriage. In her Discourse on Friendship, 1666, she stated that God made Eve as a wife and friend, but not a slave. Mary Beale was the family breadwinner, and her husband, Charles, acted as her studio manager. From their rented house in Pall Mall, they used the familiar situation of a well-to-do woman entertaining friends and acquaintances with music and refreshments to make sitters relaxed about having their portrait taken by a professional female artist. So I'll move on now to look at household perils. Wives were expected to make homes congenial, but could never make them perfectly safe. Hearths posed a great peril, although coal fires in enclosed grates were safer than open wood fires. The physician, builder and businessman Nicholas Barbon, responsible for much house building in London after the fire, opened the first office for household insurance just behind the Royal Exchange in 1680. It was still up to families to take the greatest care. Other dangers were more insidious. Home remedies for invalids might do more harm than good, as indicated by the letter Mary Evelyn received from her granddaughter Betty, who wrote, "I find the snail water agrees so well with me that I desire you will send me another bottle of it. All other things that I take makes me very sick. I would be glad to have the receipt of it to make some, if you please to give it to me." If Mary Evelyn had turned to the Queen's closet opened for the admirable and most famous snail water for invalids, it would have contained garden snails, washed in beer and popped in the oven till they have done making a noise, then pounded with earthworms, herbs and flowers. The tonics that Betty rejected must have been nauseous indeed. Homemade cosmetics presented another hazard. While people preferred to sprinkle their bodies with fragrant powders rather than immerse themselves in water, they did want their exposed flesh to be blemish-free. A clear complexion was a sign of health and good character. Many household manuals dealt with the removal of pimples and itchy pustules or tetters, promising a whiter skin. Unfortunately, their concoctions contained harmful ingredients. Woolley, for example, offered a potion for removing smallpox scars that contained caustic lime. Salves with dangerous ingredients were recommended for sunburn, breast reduction, and stretch marks after pregnancy, indicating the kinds of conditions that might tempt women to use them. Only at the end of the century did George Hartman warn in his Family Physician against all cosmetics containing mercury, white lead, or lime. Mercury gave the user convulsions or paralytic fits, discoloured the teeth and made them loose, he explained. Lead eventually turned skin black, while corrosive lime roughened the skin instead of smoothing it. He recommended that women use his own face powder made from oyster shells instead. Another problem was hygiene. As you'll know, parts of Europe were in the grip of the Little Ice Age in the second half of the 17th century, and the snow lay longer on the ground than it does today. This had consequences in the home. Waste removal from 17th century households was an unpleasant business at the best of times. During harsh winters, when the Thames froze over, it was difficult even to get water to keep homes clean. Extreme cold sapped people's strength. In rooms where there was no fire, water froze as often as it did outside. Mary Evelyn wrote half-jokingly to a relative in 1669, "The crackling of the ice and whistling winds are our music, which, if continued long in the same quarter, may possibly freeze our wits as well as our pens. No wonder the poor spent their time in an alehouse. The poor always suffered most. The bad harvests of the 1690s led to more burglary and housebreaking, even though during the last decades of the century levels of prosecuted crime stayed low. Around 1700, Captain Bower's sister, Anne, complained to him that her house had been broken into for the second time in 3 weeks. She had lost pewter, brass, the clock he had given her, and linen. House thieves often stole clothes, which they could easily pawn for cash, and targeted silver items, which they could melt down. So moving on now to the final section of this talk, the frustrations within the role of housewife. The household unit was valued as essential for social stability, just as marriage seemed fundamental to the structure of society and to the accepted gender hierarchy. Householders were expected to be charitable. Mary Evelyn's housekeeping budget for Margaret Cavendish set aside £40 to be given to the poor each year. Her daughter Mary's teenage accounts recorded her charity to poor women, as well as the modest sum she lost at cards. And just as a woman's role as mistress of the house was defined, so too was the man's, especially when his husbandry involved land management. The possibility of taming nature through careful husbandry was related to contemporary ideas for solving social and economic problems. Husbandry was a word used in many contexts. The king was expected to lower court spending and use husbandry, or the skillful management of resources, in his costly foreign wars. In the context of colonial expansion, the concept of husbandry could be used to support new English colonies in the Americas and West Indies, where ostensibly virgin territory would be farmed and made productive. But husbandry could also be used to defend domestic trades, like beekeeping, at risk from increasing amounts of imported sugar. And if formal gardens in the French taste were fashionable status symbols, gardening often had subtle links to foreign and colonial policy, as more exotic plants were brought from overseas. At Deptford, John Evelyn kept a personal notebook on husbandry. Among other things, he made a note of the weekly and quarterly jobs that needed doing in his grounds: when to sow kitchen foods, how to graft different plants, how to kill pests, and how to preserve fish in frosty ponds by breaking surface ice. It is unlikely that he did this work himself, but he equipped himself to oversee it. He also made notes on elegant stable design, listed horse medicines, and recorded how best to train hunting dogs. Even Captain Bowery in Wapping owned books on husbandry. They included books on how to brew beer, or how to do mechanical exercises, a book that covered blacksmithing, joinery, carpentry, turning wood, bricklaying, and plastering. But if there were social and international contexts that influenced the way people thought about their households, their homes were also places full of personal meetings, chambers where children had been born and died, closets where confidences were whispered or letters placed in secret compartments of writing desks, parlours associated with the sound of tuning strings, and kitchens full of familiar pots and pans. In Cromwell's time, the long handles of skillets had carried mottos such as "The wages of sin are death," or "Pity the poor." But everyday objects often had meanings and associations that brought comfort. It was in the home that many created a sense of self. Some women feared that a housewife's skills were undervalued. The author of An Essay in Defense of the Female Sex was angered by men's dismissal of women's conversation about household affairs. She thought that the regulation of the family and government of children and servants, the provident management of a kitchen, the planning of meals and matching of furniture were all important items. Male contempt for this work seemed unfair given that women's intellects were forcibly confined to domestic matters, and given that homes would be mere bedlams without female effort. Female education became a topic of increasingly heated debate. Hannah Woolley was provoked into claiming that most in this depraved later age think a woman learned and wise enough if she can distinguish her husband's bed from another's. She argued that women were born as intelligent as men and only deprived of learning in case they rivaled husbands. In similar vein, the author of Advice to the Women and Maidens of London assured her readers that the masculine art of bookkeeping was no more difficult than lace making, and women had better master it in case they had to run the family business as widows. But even when women received education and couples ran their home as a partnership, women's ultimate subservience to men was understood to be the norm, and at all social levels firmly embedded in the country's religious and legal frameworks. So, coming to an end now, it is impossible to tell how women began to view the larger world from their homes. But Evelyn's clever daughter Mary wrote a satirical poem that he published after her death, which yields rare insights. In it, she describes the contents of a lady's dressing room, as women's supporters and detractors often did, offering a mock defense of the fashions and ornaments women of taste thought essential. And she added a fop dictionary to explain the latest terms for cosmetics, hairstyles, and clothing. Evelyn may have published his daughter's satire as evidence of her own good sense and virtuosity, yet her poem reveals a detailed knowledge of the latest accessories and furnishings, and the trendy French names for them, just when French immigration and the demand for luxury goods was causing concern. Worse, her satire promptly elicited a poetical response, apparently by a woman, criticizing men of fashion as effeminate fops. It warned that fops were liable to ruin themselves and end up in seamy Alsatia, the Whitefriars district of London, outside the city's jurisdiction. Just a few streets away from mainstream London, Alsatia had its own customs and thieves' language. This second satire contains references to homosexual activities and semi-criminal lifestyles, lightly masked in slang terms and the affected French that fops used. Taken together, these two satires suggest that few women exposed to London society could maintain a cloistered mindset. The complex urban perspective they brought to household duties would fuel conflict and frustration. In short, glimpses of a humdrum topic like household management reveal much about the wider tensions of the age. Thank you. And this is a shameless plug. If you enjoy finding out about London in the 17th century, you may like my latest book, which is a snip and can be bought online. Sorry about that.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And we have the book at the Athenaeum. I was going to look for it today and it was gone, so it's checked out. But you can check it out from the Athenaeum. You can buy it online. I think Tess will also put up at the end. This is fascinating. I want to tell you, it's so much fun. All of our households that are gathered. We have guests from the United Kingdom, from Wales and London and elsewhere in England, from various places in Canada. We've got almost all the M's and states covered: Montana, Michigan, Maryland, Missouri, Minnesota, Maine, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, North Carolina, New Jersey, California, Illinois, various places in Philadelphia. It's wonderful to have folks from all over coming to hear and learn today. We have some great questions and invite you all, if you have your questions, to put them in the Q&A so we can ask them of Margaret Lincoln. Connecticut, thank you, Claire. So first of all, I'm curious, what inspired you? Your work has been, you were the head of the Maritime Museum. Your previous works have been about maritime history. What inspired you to write this book, and which includes this chapter?
Well, I live in London. It's a fascinating city, and I have to say that 2 chapters in the book are about maritime London. And I saw that there hadn't been a book about 17th century London that covered the whole century. And there hadn't been a book that integrated maritime London and political and social London. So I saw a gap, and I thought it'd be interesting to do it. And the book was great fun to write. I had a great time doing it.
Well, this is fascinating. I'm sure folks will be very interested in reading even more. I'm hearing lots of great feedback here. People are sharing. Margaret, this is interesting. She notes that her granddad, as a baker in King's Lynn, England, still had to bake Christmas puddings for housewives in the 1930s.
Well, that's amazing to know that. I mean, households just didn't have ovens. You know, they had grates and hobs, but it was very rare to have ovens until Victorian times, you know, when you see those big cast iron jobs with doors. So they just took everything that needed baking, like pies, to the local baker who popped them in the oven for them after he'd made the bread.
It's very nice. I wish I could do that some days. That's wonderful. So we have a question noting that many of the paintings that you use to illustrate your talk seem to be Dutch, and wondering about that.
Well, no, you're right. I mean, I've discovered that if you record your talk, on Zoom, you need an awful lot of images, and there just aren't that many images of English interiors. So I did resort to Dutch interiors because there was a great deal of interchange between, you know, Holland and London anyway. And of course, William III was Dutch. So I thought I could get away with it, but well spotted.
That was very interesting. And Rosanna was wondering what would be some of the types of literature that women would be able to get their hands on at the time and that they would find interesting.
Well, ballads. I mean, ballads were very cheap, and they were sold at street corners, and you could buy them for a penny. So a lot of ordinary women would have had ballads. The well-to-do would, of course, be expected to know their Bible and to read sermons. But if they were educated like Mary Evelyn, they might have read the classics in translation. And the Royal Society was publishing a lot of work, which if their husbands were interested, and Peeps was interested, then their wives might learn some science, some early science too. I mean, Peeps tried to teach his wife how to use globes, and they read books together. So it really depended on the status of your husband too, I think.
And you said that about in 17th century of London, about 50% of the women were literate. What was the number for men? And were most of these women educated, say, at home by their mothers or fathers, or were there schools that they would go to? How would they learn to read?
Well, I'm sure many here will know it's very difficult to measure literacy because people were taught to draw their names and then we say they're literate. There were many more men than women who were literate, I mean, obviously, but they were taught a little bit by their mothers or by tutors or charity schools. And we know that literacy was increasing because I've looked at court cases that involve collisions on the Thames between different boats. And the younger sailors were certainly more literate than the older sailors. So you can see this, you know, with trade and the need to be able to do maths, people were becoming more and more literate as time went on. Of course, more people in London were literate than in the countryside. And it was useful to have a servant who could do basic maths. They weren't cheated in the market. You know, you could get them to do your household accounts to a certain extent. So women were a lot more educated than we used to think they were. You know, they could do basic maths, which is why they made such good shopkeepers and helped out with, you know, with their husbands. So our views
There's
are
another
changing.
question that you are you talked about, like Mary Evelyn was 14 when she got married, and children get engaged as young as 7. But then you also noted the higher classes didn't tend to marry as young as Mary Evelyn was. Why did the I mean, I think our general view of you know, pre-20th century was that people got married very young. Why was the marital age slightly older in the 17th century for the higher classes?
Well, servants got married in their early 20s because they were expected to save up so that they could buy the linen and prepare themselves for marriage and get a home together. And I think genteel women, obviously they could marry young, but they tended to be a little bit older, and their husbands were a little bit older because they were keeping their status. The husband had to provide a home that befitted their own rank in life. And they weren't going to live in a cottage, you know, they wanted all the proper accoutrements. So that took time to save up for. So paradoxically, the very rich girls might be marrying young because their parents were making these alliances, you know, putting land together or building important trading families. And the very poor girls who are out on the streets might be married young or married in a certain way young, but otherwise it was later. I saw a question in the Q&A too about Mary Beale being a professional artist.
Yes.
And that's absolutely right. She was a professional artist. I didn't mean to imply that she was an amateur. But in London, there were amateur circles of female artists, like Susanna Evelyn's mother-in-law, and Susanna herself. It was a kind of genteel hobby, if you like, sort of fashionable talent that genteel, well-educated women were expected to have. But Mary Beale herself is certainly a professional and very talented, and she's being increasingly recognized now. There are exhibitions of her work, although she's been neglected for centuries.
I was fascinated by your image of the chair when you talked about chairs and furniture. This weekend, my daughter and I went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We have a new wing open with American art, and there's a whole section on chairs and how much you can learn about socioeconomic status and so forth from chairs. And one of the things the exhibit talked about was that in the 17th century, many households might just have one chair that the head of household would sit in. And I'm wondering what you may have learned in your research about chairs and furniture and socioeconomic status of a household.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, furniture was pretty basic, but it was becoming very ornate and well designed. And you can see this in chairs because of the shortage of oak, they were making them with cane. But whether or not you had the latest fashion in chairs, given that this was a Dutch design, you were also making a political point. You know, that if you stuck to the old English ways, you weren't actually signaling that you were particularly loyal to William and Mary. So it would be a good thing if you got yourself, you know, the latest fashionable Dutch furniture, which is also in the French style, of course, not least because you may have been on the wrong side in the civil wars and be trying to edge your way back into favor. So people were very astute about what signals they were sending with their interior design. And of course, a lot of it was French. A lot of it was coming from Huguenot workers who were escaping persecution in France, who were a lot better than the native English designers.
So
I think we have time for one last question. That would be, what was the most fascinating thing that you learned or that surprised you in your research for this particular part of the book?
Well, so many things really. I was quite interested to learn that Mary had a weight problem. I mean, you can sympathize with that. That she had to go on these enormous walks to try and keep her weight down while her husband was away in the wars. But of course, because she was a bit bored and a bit unhappy, she ate for comfort. So it's kind of something you can relate to, really. That even the Queen of England has this weight problem, and she always felt that she was being watched, by people who wanted to find fault with her. So if she didn't eat, they thought maybe she was sickening for something. And so for that reason, she ate too. So I made sure that got into the book. Yeah.
Well, it's really fascinating. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. As we see when you look in the chat, all the folks have really enjoyed this talk. And again, if you are interested in picking up your own copy of the book, you can go to the Athenaeum site on bookshop.org, which is an online bookstore that supports independent bookshops. So a portion of the proceeds go to support independent bookstores, and a portion also goes to support the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. So we encourage you to buy Margaret Lincoln's book and read it. If you want to get on the waiting list for the book at the Athenaeum, you may do so also. We have some more programs coming up. I don't know. Yep, there we go. This Friday, we have the last of our spring chamber concert series. Again, it's socially distanced and masked, and a wonderful opportunity. We had Jordan perform with his spouse this last fall, and he's coming back himself solo on the guitar. It will be wonderful. I think there are 1 or 2 tickets left, or you can live stream it if you're coming from elsewhere, like London or Canada or Minnesota or Michigan. We would love to have you join us live streamed. June 8th, we have a noon program about the abandoned canals of Schuylkill navigation, which is being given by Sandy Sorleen, who was able to do much of her work thanks to a fellowship, a Peterson Fellowship from the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. Meredith Small, Venetians Invented Everything, again with our global theme on June 8th at 6 p.m. And a few more things coming up, but you can go to our website at philathenaeum.org. /contact us to get on subscribe to our e-newsletter, which will come on Monday mornings to your site, your email package, your email page, inbox, that's what it's called. And you can find out the upcoming programs. If you're interested in becoming a member, go to our membership page. If you want to learn more, just browse our new website and enjoy it. Follow us on social media at Athenaeum. And please join me by putting in the chat and by virtually sharing your gratitude to Margaret Lincoln for joining us from London for a talk tonight. We're so grateful.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been ours. This has been wonderful.
Thank you very much. Nice to see
Thank you. Wish you a wonderful evening.
You too. Well, it's bedtime, but thank you.
Yes, bedtime for you. Yes. Have a great day tomorrow. The sun will rise.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah, good night.